Hello, welcome to the Peaceful Wood Turner. I was camping, and this piece of wood was already down and dead and part of just a pile of brush and everything else, and it was just calling out to me to bring it home and see what's going on inside. These, I believe, are woodpecker holes, where the woodpeckers just methodically work their way along. May have contributed to why it ended up coming down. But I brought it home. I did everything I could to make sure that there's nothing alive inside, no bugs or anything else. And I had it quarantined before I brought it home. I didn't want to transfer bugs from one area to another. That kind of stuff can be a big problem. So now I'm going to put it on the lathe and see what we can do with it. I'm going to cut off the ends first. As you can see, it's a bit uneven at this side and it's got some checking. Same thing with some checking on this side. So I'm going to trim these both down. That'll get rid of some of these high spots and make things a little safer for turning. I'm going to take a chisel and just kind of clean off these parts where there's a little bit of a branch sticking out here and there, and take off some of the loose bark, and then I'm going to get it on the lathe and see what we got inside. So here we have it. This end came off pretty smooth. This end got some ridges and stuff, just the way it ended up going through the table saw. Trying to take it through safely and carefully. Sometimes things didn't line up exactly right, which is just fine. There's some neat color and figure on the inside of this, so I'm hoping to be able to keep some of that. Next thing I'm going to do is just chisel some of this off and hopefully get rid of some of the bark. Cleaned up on the lathe. From this angle it's hard to see, but I've got this with the faceplate so that it's really secure. And I'm going to be going at about 1200 RPM. I'm sorry, not 1200 RPM, about 680 RPM. There's still a lot of vibration from this. You know, obviously no matter what I do before I get it on here, it's going to be a little bit uneven in terms of weight. But I should start taking that down pretty quick. I'm going to start with my roughing gouge. And if things are going smoothly, I'll probably switch out to the spindle gouge. So now that this thing has had a little bit of time and I've been able to kind of get to know this piece of wood a little bit, I think what I'm going to do is make a kind of a beer stein out of it. I'm going to have to get rid of a little bit more of this. This is just, it's really loose, and could be dangerous for my turning. It also, of course, will not be nice on the stein because it's just bad color and everything else. But the rest of this is really pretty. So what I'm going to do is start by parting right about here. I'll take this piece off, and then this will be my section that I'll end up working with. But that way I can bring it back down, stabilize it, and keep working on it. So I'm going to get my parting tool, start cutting it out. There's my line. I'm just going to get my saw, cut that off, reposition, and keep on going. So that is off. That's pretty, isn't it? Too bad we're going to lose a lot of that making this, but still, that should be nice. And I'll have to figure out what I'm going to do with this piece. Might turn into a Christmas ornament. I'll have to see. So now I'm just going to use my parting tool to mark my lower end here so I know where I'm working and what I'm working with. And that should give me a little bit more control too. So I'm going to go right about there. Nice, that should be a good hardy mug. So I want to straighten it a bit. Obviously this bark is going to come off. It's really tightly on there though, so at least it's safe. And while I straighten it, I'm also just going to kind of give it a little bit of a concavity right here, just to give it a nicer shape and form. And I'm going about 1200 RPM now. So my skew and I have been having some long and deep discussions about things, and I've been trying to learn to listen. I'm just going to try to smooth this a little bit. I've got some tool marks, and I got a little bit of a high spot, but I should be able to smooth this down with the skew, and that'll take off this last little bit here and get this all ready so that I can just work on the inside. And I'm going a bit faster now. I'm going about 1400 RPM. So my skew and I were not quite getting along, but we did get things a bit smoother. So what I'm going to do now is switch over and start working on the interior. And I'm going to start with just using a Forstner bit, going in kind of deep and getting this started to be hollowed out, and then I'll work with the bowl gouge. Alright, I've got my Forstner bit set up in the chuck, and I'm going to start just taking this out little by little. I'm going to go with larger and larger bits until I get to a size that I feel comfortable with. And I'm going a lot slower now, about 680 RPM. So I went up to 1.5 inches. I think that's a pretty good width for me to start working on the end. So I'm going to dismantle all my stuff and switch things out. I'm going to give you a different camera angle so you can see a little bit better. And I'm going to start hollowing this. So we're all reset now. I've got my bowl gouge, and we're going to be going at about 1100 RPM to start with. There's still just a little bit of vibration and stuff coming from this, and my primary reason for avoiding that is simply the camera can't focus because it's sitting on the workbench. So a little annoying, probably should be going faster, but I'm trying to share my journey, so I'm going to start working on just opening this up a little bit, and at the same time getting better with my bowl gouge. So here we go. That's coming along really nicely. There's a lot of figure in there. Unfortunately, there's also a little bit of uneven texture, so it's going to be tricky for me to keep going with this and not end up basically cracking the piece. I'm going to have to go very carefully, very slowly. I'm going to see if I can switch out my tool rest to one of my stainless steel ones that has a little bit of a curve to it. This is a tight space though, so we'll see. So I've got the stainless steel in there, gives me a little bit more control. I'm going to try to go a little bit deeper here. So I was afraid I was going to get a crack if I dug too deep and too greedy, and I did. And unfortunately, pieces started to really break. So what I've done is just cut it off with the saw before it became dangerous, and I'm going to have to make just a smaller vessel here. It'll be a nice little cup. I do have to be careful. There's still some soft spots, but I'm going to basically just try to make something out of a fail here. So this will turn into a little cup, and hopefully it'll be pretty. I'm making good progress. My concern now is sometimes I get a little too greedy down here and I end up going too deep. So I have to be careful with that. Just not dig in too far. So I'm just going to kind of, at this point, work on widening out very carefully. And I'm going to have to smooth the outside a little bit, even things up a little bit. I've gone as deep as I can on the inside without being a problem. I don't want to make another funnel. I've done that a few times. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of bring this down a little bit. It's just the wrong scale for this size of cup. It was fine for something that was a good bit bigger, but now it's way too wide of a base. I'm going to bring it down closer to how this is and just try to clean up my tool marks a little bit, and then I'll part it off and figure out how to make a handle. Alright, that looks pretty good. I'm going to need to do a bit of sanding. Got some tool marks left, but not too bad. So I'm going to start sanding that now, and then I'll put a little bit of oil on it just to raise the grain, sand it down some more. And I think what I'll do is I'll use this part down here, once I part this off, to provide the wood for my handle. I'm going to start with a 150 grit, a little bit aggressive, but I've got some marks here that are a little deep. Everything I do on the outside I'm going to do on the inside too. I've got my dust collection all set up. I've been forgetting to turn this on during this project, and I keep turning it on partway through. You might see in some of the video earlier my hand reaching over for something. That's where the switch is, so because I keep forgetting to turn it on. So anyway, I'm going to get this going. I've got all my protection on, my dust mask, my face shield, everything else. And I'm going kind of slow now. I'm going to be going at about 580 RPM. So that's all sanded down. It's really satiny smooth. I'm just going to part it off, and then I have to work with my handle. I've made a couple of cups with handles. They've come out, so hopefully this one will come out a little nicer, and hopefully I can really incorporate some of the figure that I'm sure is in this to make the handle for this. So I'm going to part it off, and we'll reset things and see where There's the parted off piece. I think it looks nice as it is, but I do want to put a handle on it. And I'm thinking actually my proportions are right, that if I just cut this straight down the middle pretty much, it'll be almost right for my handle. I'm just going to take a little bit off kind of over here and just kind of bring it down a bit. I have a couple problems here. This is kind of junky punky right here, and there's some cracks coming through. They don't come all the way through at the moment, but I'm pretty sure that those weak points do come all the way through. I have no reason to think otherwise. I like this though, it's really pretty. I might sand it and use it for something. Another issue I have with the cup itself, there is a fail right here that goes through just a tiny bit to the other side. The wood's soft enough that when I popped off the little nub that was left from parting it off, it actually took off a piece inside. It kind of dug in a little bit. So I'm going to have to be real careful as I finish this off, especially working with this piece. I'm going to cut off and end up using much more of this wood over here, that even though it's not as pretty, it's going to be much safer. So I'm going to start by cutting this in half, and then I'll start trying to figure out my exact shape, keeping in mind that I have some holes that I'm going to have to work with. Cut it down. This piece is done for the moment anyway, and this is what my handle is going to come from. You can see it's a little tall, so that's just fine. I'm going to cut off a little bit and get it closer to the same size, and then I'll work on shaping it. Probably going to cut this in half and just use one side of it, but I want to get my height and stuff right first and figure that out. If you ever want to see the inside of a screw hole, cut right through that. You can barely even see the top of it because that part got cut away, but you can see just a little bit of the grain there, and definitely see the threads right there. It's kind of cool. So that's cut down to about the same height. That's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that I had plenty of depth up here, so that when your hand comes through, there's plenty of space for it. You can always drop off a finger at the bottom, but you need the definite size up at the top. So that's pretty good. Next thing I'm going to do is try to just trim this down a bit, get it closer to the right size, and start figuring out taking out the inside. So I went ahead and took off a little bit of the thickness here. Just did that on my scroll saw, and that'll let me work with this a little bit better. I'm going to have to just try to transfer that curve over, and unfortunately it's going to be a little tricky because it's a complex curve. So it's going to take a lot of patience, which, if you've watched any of my stuff, you know I am not known for my patience. So, let's see what I can do here. Got the compass. I'm going to transfer my curve. Same thing down here. All right. It's a rough line here, here. So hopefully I can get this to line up well on my saw. That's better. And at the same time I'm going to cut out inside here and bring this edge around a little bit. So I'll be taking most of this out and getting rid of that hole. So that's cut out. Feels like it'll be a good size for the hand once it gets sanded off and thinned a little bit. I need to cut these curves up here, down here, and then I'll be able to start fitting it on. But that's about what we're going to have. I think that should be nice. Alright, from the top, looks like it pretty much fits nicely. From the sides and the bottom, not so much. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to my rotary tool and start sanding this a bit, taking it down bit by bit. Got a lot to take off down here, got a little to take off up here. Obviously I want to get rid of that screw hole, so a couple little pieces. It's looking pretty good. However, got so much meat up here, it almost looks like the handle is upside down. I want that shape in there, but I've got to take a lot more of that off. So that was a 120 grit wheel, and it was still pretty aggressive. I'm going to go now with a 220 grit sponge. One of the things that I have trouble with when I'm doing this kind of thing is that I'll end up pushing down really hard on one end, trying to make the pressure here, and I'll snap the thing. So I have to be careful. I'm always saying I have to be careful, and then I'm breaking stuff. Those lines are kind of neat. They look like they're gouges, but they're really not. They're just lines in the grain. You got some of them in here too, right in the same area. I run my finger right over them. I can't even dig my nail into them or anything. They're just discoloration. It's going to be nice. I'll do a little bit more sanding up here just to try to even out any high spots. Got a lot of lines and it looks like it's from the sander, but it really isn't. So it's kind of messing me up because I want it to be looking smoother than it wants to look. But I'm going to keep working on it. lines going this way. They're definitely from the sander. So I skipped over some of the sanding, but I've got it all sanded down now. You can see there's not very many marks going this way. There's still my lateral lines, which is fine. It feels nice and smooth. So it's going to be going right about there. And all I'm going to do now is get things set up for putting on an epoxy. I'm going to need to clean this, get all the dust and everything off of it. I'll clean my work area, and then I'll get the epoxy on it. A nice thick coat of a finish epoxy. And probably do that about 2 or 3 times, but I'll show you. Everything's cleaned. Before I can epoxy, I'm going to need to glue. So I've got this high strength clear glue. Get it right on there. A little bit of push out, not too much. Of course, I'm wiggling it all over the place because I didn't quite get the right grip on it. I tested this clamp already. It holds well on the inside, which is nice. Don't want any excess glue on this anywhere. I'll have to sand any of that off. So that looks pretty good. That's going to need to sit for a while before I can start doing the epoxy. So my syringes failed and I had to use a different method, but I've got equal parts in here now. It's weird how when you start mixing it, it gets all cloudy at first, just from the chemical reaction. I've used this same finish on a couple other pieces, like this goblet that I did before. It came out really nice. You can see it's got a really nice shine to it. It just sits on top of a wine rack right now. But I also did a thinner coat on this mug, cup, whatever. I think I'm getting better at making these. I don't like this one quite so much. For one thing, it's tiny. It looks like it'll hold something close to a cup of tea, but it's not even close. Might work for espresso. All right, it's starting to harden a little bit. It's going to leak out of the hole in the bottom, which is why I'm making sure I hit the bottom kind of early. Now I'm going to just start working it around on the outside. Pretty sure if I used a brush for this, I would get a smoother finish. Maybe I should invest in some of those sponge brushes, because it's not really worth it otherwise. It's not quite leaking out the hole in the bottom yet. I'm going to put some more, a little heavier now, and this time what I'm going to do is just kind of tip it around. I'm actually working it almost all the way to the top. Picked up a little bit of the old stuff. My work surface here is covered with some parchment paper, which almost nothing sticks to, unless of course you're trying to make sure that nothing sticks to it, and then whatever you're working with sticks to it. But it works well for this because I've never had a piece stick. I figure this finish is going to go on here thick enough and heavy enough that it'll actually help to hold this handle on along with the adhesive. So it'll be an additional layer of strength for the adhesive. I'm putting it on thick, but I'm also spreading it around so that it gets as thin as possible, because otherwise you will have drips and runs all over. It's going to take a few coats to really get a nice finish on here. I'm not going to show you every coat. Just to give you the heads up, I'm going to sand it carefully between coats, and because this is something I do as kind of a hobby, hanging out in my basement kind of thing, it's going to be a while before I have time to get back down to this and do the next coat, so everything is going to set really well. This would be a test in patience, otherwise you'd have to have another project or 3 to work on to keep yourself from going back and checking on it, because it really needs at least 24 hours to set. But you can see it's coming up with a nice shine. Looks really good on the inside. It's just started to leak out on the bottom. So I'll show you. So it came out pretty nice. We've got multiple coats of the acrylic on here. The only problem I really ran into is I ended up with kind of an uneven surface on the bottom, and that's because I switched my technique. I was using, I was pouring the material into here and then using the stick to move it around, and I switched to using a brush, a little sponge brush, and it didn't do quite as good a job there, but it did get a better coat on the outside with less running and dripping on the bottom. So a couple of lessons learned there, and got to be careful about exactly how I apply it. Obviously I want to get a better coating on the sides, and I want to get a more even coating on the bottom. Other than that though, this turned out really nice color, really nice figure in the grain, all sorts of different stuff going on. So I really like this piece. Thank you for joining me on the Peaceful Woodturner.